Tag. That is the most German I will use because I am very good at butchering every language that I try to speak. So I will not attempt any more German tonight or at any time ever. So my name is Raymond Camden. I'm a developer evangelist for a company called Here Technologies. We actually do have an office in Germany. I forget which city, but I think it's multiple cities. But we do stuff with location. So everything from JavaScript maps to routing to even more routing stuff, anything involving mapping and navigation. We have a lot of developer APIs for. I'm not talking anything at all about my company stuff today, but if that sounds interesting to you, definitely reach out to me. I blog at Raymond Camden, which is built on the product that I'll be talking about today. And you should definitely follow me on Twitter if you have any questions. My DMs are open. You can reach out at any time. And I only tweet like really important stuff. So you should absolutely follow me for prime Twitter content. I'll also say the slide deck that I'm sharing today and the demos are all up on GitHub on the link that you see on screen there. But again, if you don't have a chance to copy that down, just ask me later and I will be happy to share. So I am here to talk about Eleventy, also sometimes 11ty. I like to spell it out most of the time. Yes, another static site generator. I've been using static site generators for 4 or 5 years now, maybe. And there's like 400 of them. So Eleventy is one more out there, but I'm very excited about it. So much so that when I discovered it, I think back in October, I fell in love with it so quick that I began the process to convert my blog over to it from Jekyll. And I'd be happy to talk about why I did that and why it made sense for me. So basics, it is JavaScript-based. I've mentioned that I moved from Jekyll as my primary static site generator. Still like Jekyll a lot. Really did not care for the fact that it was built on Ruby. Nothing against Ruby in general, but I use Windows and Ruby tends to be a bit hard to install. It's gotten better. The last time I did it, it wasn't too bad, but just the fact that I was a bit scared to install it again just kind of, tells you the fact that it's not the best experience on the Windows platform. Biggest thing for me with Eleventy though is that it's extremely, extremely flexible. Before I started using Jekyll, I was using Hugo. Hugo is incredibly fast, incredibly powerful, but to me, and this is just my opinion, it didn't feel very flexible. And this was, 2 years or so ago back when I was using it, but there were certain things that I was trying to do with it that I felt that Hugo was kind of fighting me to get accomplished. I have a very large site for my blog, been blogging for almost 20 years, have somewhere around 6,500 blog posts. I'm not trying to brag. I'm not saying those are good blog posts. But in terms of like a JAMstack blog, I had a very large site so that my needs were probably not typical in that regards. And at the time, I felt like Hugo just wasn't working for me. That's why I switched to Jekyll. Eleventy pretty much lets you do anything that you can think of. And I greatly appreciate that flexibility because that's been something that I've kind of needed to make a site of my size to make that work, to make it performant and so forth. And speaking of speed, it is fast. I say fast-ish because it may not be as fast as Hugo. It may not be the fastest one out there, but it's certainly fast enough. Now, definitely, like when I'm working on my blog, I have to do things to make it work a bit quicker. I think it takes Eleventy, I want to say 60 to 70 seconds to parse all 6,500 or so blog entries. But even though that's really fast, when I'm working locally, that's not fast enough. So I do things on my local install to make it so that it's only looking at like 1 year's worth of content. And I don't actually have an example of that, but if you want to see more about that later, just let me know. Just a few more basics. The website is eleventy.dev. It is currently version 0.11. That's totally a coincidence. As far as I know, it's not staying at that forever, to be cute. But I believe it just switched to this version maybe 2 or so months ago. It is up on GitHub. You can look at the open issues. You can look at the source code if you want. Honestly, I mean, I love Eleventy. I've only looked at the source once or twice to try to find something. But definitely you can go there to report issues and make suggestions. They are also on Twitter at 11_TY. I absolutely never remember that, so I really appreciate TweetDeck's autocomplete. In terms of installation, there's kind of 2 main ways. The way that I prefer is to install Eleventy as a global CLI. To me, that just makes the most sense. If you look at their documentation, however, you'll see that they use a slightly different way where they install it as a dev dependency and then use npx. That's what their docs say, and certainly there's nothing wrong with that. I just personally prefer having the global CLI. That just works better for me. Every single thing I'm talking about today, everything that you do with Eleventy is not going to change based on how you install it. So the CLI is incredibly simple. It basically has 2 features. So one feature is just to take your site and convert it to a static site. And the second option is basically to do the same thing, but to also fire up a web server so that you could test and see stuff. Hot reload is kind of baked in, and I'll show an example of that later. But essentially, like, that's the entire CLI. There are some flags, there's some things you can do to say, hey, use this output directory instead of the default. But in general, everything you do is going to be based on those 2 commands. Pretty much Eleventy serve is what I will use all the time. And when I deploy my site to Netlify or wherever, I'll use just plain Eleventy to do that one-time conversion. So a quick demo, and y'all wave at me if this, I can make that bigger, hold on. So I have a markdown file, and I'm gonna just say, hello world. I would try to spell Guten Tag, but I'd probably do a bad job of it. Make that a little bit bigger. And this is some awesome markdown, etc. stuff. I have this file, it's in a directory, and I'm gonna go to my terminal. And all I'm gonna do is run Eleventy. So what this is gonna do is gonna look at the 1 grand total file I had in my website. So it's gonna run pretty darn quick, 0.15 seconds. It's gonna output to a folder called _site. That is a default that you can modify. And then when I look at it, I essentially just have that markdown converted to HTML. Nothing too crazy there, but I'm trying to keep it a little bit simple. If I run the web server, I will get one up at localhost 8080. And I will pop over here real quick. You'll see my markdown. I'll make that bigger. And now if I go in here and fix my typo and add 1 more paragraph, literally 1 more paragraph, I'll save it, come back, and reload, and there it is. So right now it's essentially a fancy markdown processor. It's not that complex. But we're going to build on this and show more and more features. By the way, I did mention hot reload earlier. In order for hot reload to work, which basically means I didn't have to actually hit reload on the web browser, in order for that to work, you need a full HTML web page. And by that, I mean a head and a body. If I view source on this, you'll see all I have is my header and paragraph. When we start talking about layout files and we actually include, proper HTML, you'll see that happen automatically. So in order to support more dynamic aspects instead of just Markdown, Eleventy supports a set of template languages that will allow you to write some code. Now, I mentioned that Eleventy is very flexible, and this is a great example of that because it supports out of the box HTML, Markdown, JavaScript, Liquid, Nunjucks, and more. Handlebars, Mustache, EJS, Haml, Pug, which if you don't know is the new name of Jade, and even JavaScript template literal. So what's nice is that, each of these template languages has its own way of doing things. I used to like Handlebars for a long time. I felt it was a bit too strict. When I started using Jekyll for my blog, I really fell in love with Liquid. So I use Liquid. Even though I like Liquid, it's not entirely possible to do everything in that particular language. EJS, on the other hand, essentially is like writing classic ASP. I mean, you could do some horribly ugly code. One of the things that I really love about Eleventy is that on my blog, I had one page where I needed some crazy ugly code. Liquid definitely could not handle it. Well, Eleventy has no issue with me just saying, hey, on this page, I'll just use EJS. So I used EJS on that one page that needed that kind of crazy, ugly code, and I used Liquid everywhere else. So in my particular example, I am going to use Liquid. If you don't like that, if you prefer nunchucks, if you prefer handlebars, you could use whatever makes sense for you. I'm going to make a new file. I'm going to call it ray.liquid, and I'm just going to start off with some basic HTML. Hello. And do a bit of Liquid code. So I'm going to say name equals Ray, and I'm going to say hello name. And again, if you've never seen Liquid before, the bracket % is essentially a way for me to execute a line of code. In this case, I'm assigning a variable name to the value Ray, and the double brackets is basically just going to output it. I can do one more example. I'll do a basic conditional, cool equals true. And this is how you would do a basic if clause. Yes, Ray is cool, and end if. And I apologize if that typing was super loud. I tend to attack my keyboard. So if I go back in here, I called that file ray.liquid, so it'll be available at /ray. I could see hello Ray, I could see Ray is cool. If I go in here and say I'm not cool, that's what my kids think, I should see it go away when I reload. So Liquid supports more than just conditions and variables. It supports looping. It has, essentially, small programming language baked in. It's absolutely not in JavaScript. You can't do everything in it. But the kind of basic type things that you'd want to do on a dynamic page based on data, again, conditions, looping, etc., Liquid makes pretty easy to use. And again, if you don't like Liquid and prefer handlebars, you just switch to a .hbs file, and Eleventy is good to go. So let's talk about actually adding a layout. We will define this in front matter. Most static site generators will use front matter to define metadata about a file, and you'll see an example of that. By default, this has to be in a folder called _includes. Again, you can customize that if you would like. You can also do chained layout. So I may have a core site layout, but then I may have blog posts that have their own layout that then call the main site layout. If you want to do that, you can. Front matter typically begins with 3 dashes and then some key value pairs. You can see an example here where I'm going to define layout by passing a name. When I do that, Eleventy is going to look for somename.liquid, somename.hbs. Essentially, it will look at all the template languages it supports and try to match that particular value with that particular file name. So let me show an example of that. Again, I'm going to go into the folder I've been working on. I'm going to add a new folder, includes, and I'm going to make a file called main.liquid. And I'm just going to do real quick, full, real proper HTML file, /body/HTML. And Eleventy is going to pass my page values in a variable called content. So I could drop that right into my liquid file. The page contents will be dropped in there. And I could say header. This is going to be an ugly page. And a footer down here. I'm going to go back into my markdown file. I'm going to add that front matter, layout, main. I'll leave it like that. And while I'm here, I'll do the same to my liquid file. Layout, main, and end it like that. And if I go back, I should see, when I reload, my header and footer. And now that I actually have a proper, kind of full HTML page, if I change my name to Raymond and save, and Alt-Tab back, it should reload for me automatically. So once I've got that proper DOM thing going on there, I don't have to worry about the incredibly difficult task of hitting Control-R. Eleventy will do that for me. So obviously, I could do a much nicer layout for this. I do want to show one kind of cool feature is that I can do other values. I'll pass a title, my home page, or I should say my Ray Liquid testing page. And then in my layout, I'm going to add front matter here and specify default title. And I'll call it default title. I'll go in here and I will output title within my title tags. I'll save that. And when I go back, I can see that the title, that may be a bit small on the screen share, but it does have my the specific title tag that I used. If I go back to my home page where I never specified a title, the default that I specified in my layout worked for me. So again, layouts are in the includes folder by default. If I want to include a value or a file like, boilerplate text or whatever, it is going to be just something like this, include footer. And then I would save a file name called footer.liquid to put whatever text in there. I won't do that because we'll just kind of keep it simple with the layout. And again, you can also chain those, like I mentioned, if you have like a blog post with its own header and footer, and then call the main layout as well. If you wanted to, you definitely could mix and match template languages. You could write your layout file in handlebars. I would not do that. So like I said, on my blog, I did everything in Liquid, and I only used EJS on that one page where I needed something that was a bit crazy. So collections are essentially a way to group files, and that may be a little bit obvious based on the name, but this is how you'll do things like creating a simple blog. In most blogs, you will have a set of blog posts. That is considered a collection within Eleventy. In order to make that work, you will use a tag-based system where you'll take a file, you'll assign some tags, and based on the tags that are set for that file, they all become one particular collection based on the particular tag. This can be dynamic as well if you want to get a little bit crazy, but typically it's hard-coded, and it'll look something like this. So I will write a blog post. I'll specify a layout, I'll give it a title, and then I will assign tags and say something like post. As soon as I do that, as soon as Eleventy encounters a file that has a tags value, and it has a particular thing like post, that allows me then in my code to loop over it, to iterate over that data. It'll put it within a variable called collections, and it will essentially just create an array that allows me to work with those particular blog posts. This will make a lot more sense when we actually show it. I'm going to kill this web server. I'm going to run this demo first. Demo collections, and then I'll show the code behind it. I'm going to use eleventy.serve, and it's up and running. And I'll reload here. So I have an incredibly simple blog with, in this case, 2 blogs, alpha and beta. If I click, I see alpha, and if I click on beta, I see beta. So the way that this worked is that I created a folder called post, and wrote 2 markdown files. And all I did was ensure that both of them had that particular tag in there, post. Because they both have the same tags value, in my index.liquid file, I can loop over them. I can access the title. Eleventy gives me automatically access to a variable called URL, so I can link to it. And that's basically all I need. So if I go into post and make a new file, I'll call it berlin.md. So you can imagine this is how I would like write a blog post. I'm going to copy and paste from an earlier file. And this title will be Guten Tag. I probably misspelled that. I apologize. Hello, Berlin. This is me typing live. Save it. And then it automatically shows up. One thing I'm not showing here is that you can sort by dates. Eleventy has good support for parsing and sorting dates. So I could do kind of the more typical blog thing of show me my blog articles with the most recent first. You can also show a subset. So typically you don't want to show every single blog entry that you've written. With a bit more code, I could say, show me the last 10 sorted by most recent first. So that are collections. Collections can be dynamic. So if you don't want to use tags, for example, to specify what a collection is, you can actually use a bit of code to specify how that works. My blog, because I was converting from Jekyll to Eleventy, I was already using the tags value, and I was using it to, tag my content. So this is a blog post about Vue.js. This is a blog post about Eleventy. I wasn't using the tags value to say these were all blog posts. So I had to write, I would say 3 lines of code to specify a custom way to say, look at this folder, and everything here is considered to be in the post collection. So again, I keep kind of talking about how flexible Eleventy is. That's a great example of that. Another aspect that you may want to work with is data. You've already seen this a little bit. So when I specified a title value for my blog post, that was considered page data. Eleventy also allows you to do this at a directory level, and it also supports what it considers to be global data, so data for your entire website. These could be JSON files or JavaScript files. These will be stored in a directory called _data, which again, if you want to, you can customize. The name of the file will be the name of the variable. So if I make a JSON file called cats.json, I now have a variable called cats. JavaScript files can be async, and you will see an example of that. Once again, I am going to run it, and then I'll show you the code behind it. This is all in the GitHub repo if you need to see it later. Eleventy serve, and fire up. All right, let's go back, reload. So I have a home page with 2 sets of data, a set of cats and a set of Star Wars films. The way that this worked, I'm going to show the home page first, because in both cases, all I'm doing is a simple for loop for cat and cats, for film and films. However, where they come from is a little bit different. My cats is just a hard-coded JSON file. So if I wanted to add a new cat, I could literally just copy and paste this line and add new data. My films, however, is based on an asynchronous call to the Star Wars API. Now, this is only run at generation. So obviously, every time a user would hit this site, I would not be recalling the API. So I would only use this when my data can be done at the time that the thing is generated. In this particular case, Star Wars films come out once every 2 years. If need be, I can create a scheduled task to, rebuild my site once a year. If my data was a bit more dynamic, if it was updated a bit more often, for example, I'm running an e-commerce store and I want to get my products and their availability, I know how often my product data is updated. It could be once a day. So I could then very easily build something like this and set up my process such that Eleventy, rebuilds the site once a day or twice a day. that is data. It can get a little bit more complex. When you do have a lot of data, Eleventy has really good pagination support as well. It allows you to say, you know, I have, let's say, 20 or so Star Wars films. I want to create a way to paginate that. Eleventy has baked in a bunch of things to make this easy, including building links, knowing when you're on the last page, etc. All, you know, essentially everything that you've seen in a typical pagination. The links to the first page, the link to the next page, knowing what page you're on. Eleventy provides support for that. I just want to point out that it gets a little bit complex. I have a link to the doc. It does do something that I think that I've not seen done as well in any other static site generator, and that is that it solves what I call the virtual page problem. Most static site generators can be dynamic when you're working on it, and of course become static when you're done, but you typically need to have one page per URL. So for example, when my blog was Jekyll-based and I had a category page, so this is all of my JavaScript blog posts. This is all my blog posts about Star Wars. This is all my blog posts about cats. I had to build a page for each of those such that when Jekyll ran, it would output a file based on that. Eleventy allows you to kind of, you know, bypass that and create pagination based on one particular file. And I feel like that was a horrible way to say all that. So let me actually run a demo, and hopefully it will make more sense when you see it running, or when you see the code behind it. So I have a set of data, and I'm gonna reload. Okay, so I have my cats and film. So this is based on the same data as before. Cats is a hard-coded JSON file. The films are based on an API call. But now I have links, so I can click on The Empire Strikes Back, and I get, you know, the opening crawl. I did forget to change that. That's my fault, not Eleventy. And if I click on each of these, I actually have a different URL for each. What's cool is that all of this was done via one particular page. I'll show the films one first. I added some front matter and I defined a pagination block. I told it what the data is. In this case, I'm doing a size of 1 because I want 1 page per block, per data. And then I specify what the permalink is. In order to make that work, I passed in my title. Slug is a baked-in Eleventy feature that takes a string and makes it URL safe. And basically, this is all I needed to output, and we can look at the generated folder here in underscore sites, and you can see all of those folders based on the Star Wars films. So if I were to actually fix this, do that now, I should see it update. There we go. But again, like, this is something that's not been trivial, at least in the static site generators that I've worked with. In Jekyll in the past, I had to solve this with a Ruby-based plugin that I did not enjoy writing at all. And Eleventy, I think, just makes this so darn easy that I just really, really appreciate it. But again, you know, that is a case of, you know, 1 file per thing of data. If you had a list of 90 cats and wanted to do, you know, 10 to 15 cats per page, pagination definitely supports that use case as well. So more custom stuff that I'm not going to cover based on time. If I want to create my own filter, so I have an input value that I want to transform in some way, Eleventy allows me to define custom values for that. It also allows for shortcodes where I could basically create little user-defined functions. In this case, one called user, pass in a couple values, fname and lname, and then I can write logic that would then output or return a variable based on that. It essentially allows me to extend the template language that I'm using to have more features. It does have a plugin system. I haven't used it much, but there's one plugin that's pretty fascinating. I use prism.css to do my code highlighting. Prism is a very small JavaScript file and a very small CSS file to make pretty code listings. Eleventy actually has a plugin to do all that for you, to give you the exact same output, but in a static HTML only way. And if I were to add that, I could actually remove that JavaScript and CSS dependency and make my page perform a bit better. All this is driven by a file called .eleventy.js. This is where you'll do your customizations and stuff like that. I will mention one customization because you will absolutely hit it. There's a feature called pass-through file copy. If Eleventy doesn't recognize a file, it ignores it. This is super, super crucial. So I'll say it again. If Eleventy doesn't recognize a file, it ignores it. You will run into this when you work with CSS and JavaScript that you want in your site output. So luckily, you can tell Eleventy, not Elevent, I'll fix that typo eventually, to basically copy over a set of files. That is done in the .eleventy.js file, and it takes literally one line of code. I have a demo of this. I'll skip it just for time, but it's actually in my GitHub repo where you can see I specified this to enable copying over a CSS file for the example code. So just to kind of wrap things up real quickly, definitely hit the official docs. My particular post, if you go to Raymond Camden and go in the tag section, I talk about me learning Eleventy, me playing around with it, and I definitely talk about the things that I ran into moving my large site over to Eleventy. There's no Eleventy specific Slack, but there is a JAMstack Slack at the new dynamic, and you can definitely talk about Eleventy there. I will leave you with one thing. Eleventy is not perfect. It definitely has bugs, but I typically rarely run into them. The one thing that I ran into with Eleventy is that when it supports all those different template languages, it supports a particular version of those. So for example, it supports a particular version of Liquid. Currently, it supports a slightly older version of Liquid. I ran into issues where I was trying to use a particular filter that wasn't supported. Liquid has this great feature where by default, if you tell it to use a filter it doesn't support, it just ignores it. And if you can't tell, that's sarcasm. I hate that particular feature. That's Liquid's fault, not Eleventy. So Eleventy does allow you to use a newer version of Liquid, but you have to actually go through the process of doing that. The other thing I'll point out is that coming into Eleventy from Jekyll, Jekyll also customized Liquid. And in my mind, I thought that was just Liquid stuff where I was actually using Jekyll features in particular. So I put that out there as a warning. That's the only real kind of issue I ran into when switching over to Eleventy. And that is it for me. And I'm definitely open for any questions.